About 2 weeks ago, Mouthy Buddha made a video with JF explaining race realism. About a week after that, Destiny makes his own video claiming to debunk the original video. However, throughout the video, at best, Destiny just shows a complete misunderstanding of what JF is talking about, and at worst, he is purposely misrepresenting him. So let's have a look at the first thing Destiny does, which is starting off by implying JF is being purposely vague so that the video appeals to the racist people on the internet.
I think it's very cute right here. Notice how palatable. Notice how palatable he's packaged the idea of separate races here. Notice how the only traits that he lists are inarguable traits and traits that aren't controversial. Listen.
Characteristics, including but not limited to skin color and facial features.
Notice how those are the only two that he lists, right? Nothing controversial, but just, oh yeah, different people have different skin color and facial features. Therefore, yeah, that's funny. That's cute.
Okay, so at this point in the video, Destiny is expecting JF to go through and list out every single thing that race realism entails. And if he doesn't do that, JF's dog whistling to racists. But what JF was doing was simply putting forward the two most obvious and observable differences between the races that everyone can see.
In human populations, which confirms the exit.
Yeah, he said they're not limited to that, so he leaves it open-ended enough for racists to agree with, right? Oh yeah, and other characteristics, such as IQ, cognitive ability, yeah.
So what Destiny did want was for JF to go through and list out every single thing entailed in race realism. Instead of doing the non-autistic thing and just saying the easiest and most obvious things that differentiate between the races. I think Destiny's just mad here, because JF didn't say anything that he could immediately take and argue against. So the next thing Destiny gets autistic about is JF's claim that modern science reaffirms what we have always thought about race. For some reason, Destiny takes this to mean that JF is talking about things like phrenology and other pseudoscientific sort of things from the past. This is the beginning of where Destiny starts to build a bit of a straw man against JF, and he begins to imagine some ill will that I don't think is actually there.
Or yesterday, 2 days ago, where he said that scientists have reaffirmed what we once thought to be true about race. That's absolutely not true. Phrenology as a science is completely debunked. This idea of the racial divisions that we once believed existed, that there are segments on the skull that are unique to the negroid brain or some shit, has absolutely not been verified. And if anything, genetic sequencing has given us a lot more insight into what we consider to be races or how geographic origin works than what was ever once thought. That there are a vast difference between types of black people, types of even African, sub-Saharan versus Northern Africans, different groups.
So you could probably tell right here by the way he's stuttering and looks like he's nervously sweating, desperately grabbing for reasons why what JF said is wrong. Nothing Destiny says here actually disproves any of what JF said. He's just desperately grabbing for sentences to throw out so that people won't think he's a racist. For some reason, as soon as he hears JF say that modern science reaffirms our past thoughts, Destiny immediately assumes the worst and goes straight to phrenology. He just went for the first thing he could think of from the past that wasn't correct, and thought that by showing that science doesn't agree with one thing from the past, that the overall statement is somehow false. Apparently, for some reason, Destiny thinks that because we have a better understanding of the subgroups, that all of a sudden the larger groups don't exist. You can hear him literally swallowing spit as he's nervously just making up reasons to disagree with the video. So the main argument for the first half of the video that Destiny's been making is that the word race used to mean something and it has certain other concepts attached to it. And when JF says that modern science reaffirms our past concept of race, that JF is actually saying that modern science reaffirms all of the things associated with the word race, instead of just the primary meaning. Destiny can't actually argue against what JF is saying here. Destiny can't argue against the fact that modern science does in fact affirm that the racial groups our ancestors saw intuitively are the same racial groups that modern science is reaffirming today. So instead of arguing directly against that, Destiny has taken a whole lot of stuff, attached it to the past meaning of the word race, and now Destiny's criticizing JF for not explicitly disavowing the things that were once attached to the word race, but not the actual word itself. All that needs to be true for this video to be perfectly reasonable is that modern science reaffirms what our ancestors meant when they used the word race. Since Destiny doesn't make any argument about the affirmation of only the word race in the past and only the word race in the present, and is instead strawmanning JF by throwing a bunch of shit that JF never actually claimed onto the term race. Destiny is arguing with the concepts that used to be associated with the word race, rather than what the definition of the word race used to actually be, which is simply just the intuitive groups that our ancestors saw. The core meaning of race has been reaffirmed. So he's just arguing against something that no one's actually claiming.
Right? That this kind of like intellectual dishonesty is so dangerous because it's so effective. The way that this is packaged is really well done in terms of selling you like a propagandized message that's total fucking bullshit, right? It's just, this is a total fucking lie. The idea that modern day gene sequencing has reaffirmed like phrenology or racist thoughts from 100 years ago is absolutely ridiculous. But because he's packaged it in this way, it sounds sellable because of that word race, right? Yeah, that's really interesting that he does that.
Yes, Destiny, you're very good at word games. So in the next part of the video, JF claims that because we can obviously distinguish between the features of an Asian, a European, and a black person, and that the features are heritable, that this is sufficient to conclude that race realism is true. This next bit's pretty funny because Destiny makes a straw man and then completely fails at arguing against even that. Destiny takes what JF claims and confuses individuals or small groups with large groups or generalizations. Destiny starts off his second argument in the video by using an analogy about pencils.
That races are real in humans. Indeed, the obvious observation that the facial features of Asians, whites, and black people can be easily identified, and that these features are irritable, is sufficient to conclude that race realism is true.
So again, it's such a complicated topic, but he's so good at like selling it in one-word phrases. So we can see that there are differences. So if I make an analogy, then this seems absurd, right? But so we see that there are differences in people's faces and skin, right? Therefore, races must be true. But the thing is that he's making an argument for something different, and then because he's made an argument for that difference, he instantly applies it to something else. So what JF is arguing for is that there are observable differences in people. That's true. Of course there are observable differences in people. But then he takes that argument and he somehow applies it as though it's a justification for the separation of people into races, which is, depending on how you want to approach that argument, isn't necessarily true. So here's an example of this. Let's say that I have 10 different pencils, okay? Let's say that I've got a red pencil, a blue pencil, a green pencil, all, different types of colored pencils. What I can do is I can say, here I have, I want to subdivide these into different things that are more specific than pencil, rather than just color, right? So what a person would go, they would say, well, look, you can observe, this is very different than this. The green pencil and the red pencil are very different. And you go like, well, how? They're all pencils, aren't they? You go, no. Look at all the observable differences between these pencils, These are totally different things. It's like, well, hold on, that's not necessarily true, right? Just because a pencil is a different color doesn't make it not a pencil or a different subdivision of pencil. It's just a pencil with a different color.
He tries to say that if we took a bunch of different colored pencils and tried to categorize them on anything but their color or their observable differences, that we wouldn't actually be making a meaningful categorization. The reason pencils aren't a good analogy for people is because people don't get their colors painted on from a factory. People get their colors in their genetics. If you took every person on Earth and if you removed every identifiable feature, or you just melted them down into a puddle of organic mush, you could actually take apart from each of those bits of mush, analyze them, and still determine where these people are coming from. You'd still be able to determine that they're a different group, and with enough research you might even be able to determine what these people would actually look like. Whereas if you took the pencils and scrubbed the color off them, you would have a very tough time actually telling what color the pencils once were. A more accurate pencil analogy for people would be if you got a truckload of pencils from all over the planet that were made in different countries from different factories, and using only the things like the composition of the lead or the wood, the style of the pencil, if you were only able to use these things, the not so obvious traits, and trace the origins of the pencils back to where they came from, then that would be a meaningful categorization. You would have English pencils, you would have Asian pencils, you would have Romanian pencils. Most of the confusion here, I think, comes from Destiny's inability or complete disregarding of the scale that we are talking about. JF isn't talking about half a dozen pencils. JF is talking about billions of people across millions of years.
The argument that there is something intrinsically different about these things, like what race realists say insofar as cognitive function and IQ, has to run a lot deeper than observable differences. For another really great example of
the differences do run a lot deeper than observable differences, because the observable differences come from things that are deeper than the observable differences. They come from people's genes. We can then use these cosmetic features and the genes that created them to to get more useful information about the people's origins. After the failing pencil analogy, Destiny tries to use families as an analogy. He takes JF's argument, boils it down into a syllogism, and then tries to prove that by using different inputs on the syllogism and getting different results, that the internal logic of the syllogism is inconsistent. The problem is Destiny fails at actually representing JF's argument as a syllogism, and we are about to see why.
So this is one way to debunk the argument in that he's not actually making the argument for the separation of races. There's a second way that we can debunk this argument, though, is that we can take the syllogism that he's created and we can plug different things into the premises, and we can actually generate conclusions that we don't agree with. So let's listen to the syllogism one more time. The syllogism is essentially observable differences means that race is real. Humans have observable differences, therefore race is real, right? Hold on. So
Whites and black people can be easily identified, and that these features are irritable is sufficient to conclude that race realism.
we'll listen to it at a slower speed here so that we can really think about it, okay?
Indeed, the obvious observation that the facial features of Asians, whites, and black people can be easily identified, and that these features are irritable is sufficient to conclude that race realism is true.
So, just because people have different identifiable features, that in and of itself, according to JF, is sufficient to claim that race realism is real. But race realism doesn't just mean people look different, it implies a whole lower set of cognitive functions.
So here Destiny is again strawmanning the video. JF says that, indeed, the obvious observation that facial features of Asians, whites, and black people can be easily identified, and that these features are heritable, is sufficient to conclude that race realism is true. Destiny cannot argue against that statement, so he goes on to say that race realism is much more than what JF just said. However, race realism does not have to be more than what JF just said. JF's statement is a very simple and minimal argument in favor of race realism, and judging by Destiny's reaction, an argument that he can't actually argue against. Destiny can't argue against this because JF has put forward the simple version of race realism, which is simply that the races that most people intuitively create in their own minds are actually backed up by science. This is a very simple way of showing people who are not up to date with the science that race realism is true. JF didn't use any of the more in-depth arguments about things like cognitive functions or IQ, and because of this, Destiny doesn't actually have anything he can argue against. But for some reason he still continues on to try and make an argument against the science behind race realism, and completely fails in doing so.
Now, let me instead take, I wish I could use my own family. I don't have pictures of my family. But I could instead take pictures of a group of people who are all related to one another, okay? Now, of these people that are related to one another, I could find a lot of shared features, but I could find very different features as well. If we have a great-grandma and a great-grandpa, you might see something like a different nose show up in different family members, or a different pattern of male pattern baldness, or a different height, right? How tall people are. The color blindness from a grandfather could be passed down to some children. I could take a family of people who are all of the same race, but I could show you different observable and irritable characteristics, and then I could plug that into the same syllogism and go, well, look at this group of white people, this white family, who all came from the same grandmother and grandfather, and then all other white people breeding with them, right? Well, look, there's observable differences in characteristics. Some of them are colorblind, some have different patterns of baldness, some of them have different heights, some of them have different colors of eyes, therefore, race is real, right? But when I plug in family members there, well, now all of a sudden that argument sounds ridiculous. Well, hold on. That's actually not true. Observable differences in characteristics and the fact that those observable differences are heritable isn't really sufficient evidence that race is real in the way that we mean race when we say race realism.
The reason that Destiny doesn't think the syllogism he's created makes sense is because he isn't looking at it from a broad enough perspective. The syllogism does actually work, but you don't notice it's working until you zoom out and look further back into the ancestry of those people. Or if you think about the fact that if someone in that generation did get a unique genetic mutation, everyone that descended from that particular person could one day be seen as a group. Similarly, if there was 3 people in this generation, and one went to Europe, and one went to Africa, and one went to Asia, and from those 3 people a large population was born, 1,000,000 years in the future, we might well be able to trace those groups back to those original 3 people, and we would be able to say that the descendants of these 3 different people are 3 different groups. When you compare it to humanity, you could see the original family that the 3 people arose from as humans, and then you could say all the descendants were Europeans, Africans, and Asians. And this could keep happening repeatedly. Smaller and smaller groups could keep forming, or the old groups could die off. And this would look exactly like what a tree of evolution actually looks like. So to recap this video, Destiny opens up by accusing JF of being purposely vague to appeal to the racists on the internet. He then goes on to strawman JF as believing that things like phrenology are actually confirmed by modern science. And after that, he actually does try to disprove the argument that observable and heritable features are enough to confirm race realism. Destiny provides two arguments to try and prove JF wrong. The first one is using the pencils, and the problem with this is that the means by which a pencil gets its color is different from that by how a human gets theirs. And the second argument is him using the syllogism and the families as an example of how heritability and observability are not sufficient to declare a race. But he fails in this part because he doesn't actually recognize the scale on which this discussion is happening. And so while he's only looking at a few generations, JF is talking about dozens to hundreds of generations. The reason his syllogism doesn't seem to work is because he's not looking far enough into the past or the future. If he looked at what happened to those people with those genes in the future, he may be able to make racial classifications, and if he looked at where those people came from further back than a few generations, he would also be able to make racial classifications. So it's up to you to decide whether Destiny is being stupid or dishonest, but either way, he shouldn't be taken seriously on this topic. Well, thanks for listening. I enjoyed making this video, so hopefully I'll make some more in the future.
It's very sad that somebody would construct an argument that is simultaneously unsound and invalid and then prides himself on their philosophy.